So I'm going to, as Liz mentioned, I'm going to talk today about kids today. Do they still listen to radio at all? Just a kind of bit of background, we all know this. Radar tells us it's a very good time on the whole for radio. Radio listening's up high, lots of people listening. And actually we see similar things in our Share of Ear study, which some of you may have come across before. This is a bespoke study the BBC runs, and it's trying to look at where radio fits within all audio listening. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more today. So we did a study that said, well, we understand a lot from radar about how radio listening divides up, but we didn't really understand how radio sat within all audio listening. And by that we mean things like iPods and personal on-demand radio, all those other kinds of things nowadays people can listen to the radio. So this is actually a challenge from Tim Davey when I first joined the BBC to say, let's understand how radio fits within all audio. We've done it 2 years in a row, and on the whole I think it still is quite good news for radio. We were amazed to find that radio accounts for, well, 83% last year and 82% this year of all audio listening, even in the case of all the other stuff that's going on. That said, it is much lower amongst the young. So the youngest group we go down to is the 15 to 18-year-olds. That's what I'm showing you here. Where we found that share of ear was lower amongst them. Last year, 62%. This year, hence the dotted line in the middle, we actually changed it because we realised that it isn't just audio that competes for ear for the young. It is also things like YouTube and MTV and all those other things that are effectively for them like radio. They're another audio. And when we looked at that, radio dropped to 56%. So we do think that there is something going on there and that it is more of a challenge amongst the younger audiences for radio. But lots of people asked whether this was just an age thing. Is it just because young people like to listen to their own music? Would it not have always been this with CDs or even going back to vinyl? We don't have share of ear over time, unfortunately, but we can flip back to radar to get a hint. So, as you know, radar's been around now in the same methodology for over 10 years. So this is a rather confusing chart, forgive me, I hope it's the only one that's a bit hard to read. What we looked at was, we looked at 2000, the different age groups in 2000, and then those age groups in 2010. And instead of looking at like for like, so 15 to 24-year-olds in 2000 and 15 to 24-year-olds in 2010, we wanted to actually look at the cohort group. So we looked at here, you can see the bits I've circled, 15 to 24-year-olds in 2000 as 25 to 34-year-olds in 2010. And what we found is that sadly it doesn't appear that they are growing into radio in the way that we have traditionally thought audiences grow in. And you can see it does happen at sort of the upper end. So 35 to 44-year-olds of 2000 listen to 21.3 hours of radio each week. And in 2010 they listened more or less the same, 21.6 hours. But actually if you look at those 15 to 24-year-olds in 2000, they listened to 19.4 hours, and actually now, 25 to 34-year-olds, that same cohort group, listen to less radio, listen to 17.9 hours of radio. So sadly, it doesn't look like as if they are growing into radio in the same way. But some people said radar measures live radio. Maybe it's because they're all podcasting or time shifting in some way. But we do measure this within radar, or within the Share of Ear study. It doesn't look like they're switching to podcasting. So we looked at the percent of people who said they'd ever listened. 15 to 18-year-olds, 22% had said they'd ever listened, but actually regularly listening is much lower, 6%. So it doesn't seem like they're converting in droves to podcasting. Nor does it look like they're switching to time shifting in any other form. So again, in Share of Ear we look at live and non-live listening, and what you can see there is that both reach and share to non-live listening are very, very small indeed. Part of the reason may be that they can find new music in many places now, whereas it used to be just radio, and if you look at older groups, it still is very dominated by radio. So the top bar in this chart, the question was, how do you find out about new music? This was in our Share of Ear study. The top bar is the total, and the blue bar was the youngest age group we looked at, the 15 to 18-year-olds. And whilst radio is still the biggest at 63%, what you find amongst those in the blue bars is that there's a lot more. There are many more places in which they can find out about new music. Word of mouth, that probably has always been around. Watching TV and music programs probably been around for a couple of generations. But the big new one in there as well is social networks and online, where previously in previous generations that probably didn't feature at all. So that traditional hook into radio for people, which was new music, feels like it might not be quite as strong as it used to be. But that's a bit depressing for a morning. Is there any hope? I like to be an optimist about this, so I think yes, there is some hope for radio amongst the younger generation. I think firstly because, and I often say this to people, remember that radio is radio. And there are things about radio that it does and needs that it serves that will always be true and are consistent for people. There are some core benefits of radio that meet needs people, even young people, still have. I probably, like many of you, have worked in many categories in my life, not just radio, and in every category I've worked in, there's always a need state for younger people particularly around boredom relief. There's something about passing the time and keeping you company, and radio traditionally is a great way of doing that. It keeps you, it keeps you engaged. It is your sort of other friend, I guess. And I still think that will always be important, and it is important for young people, passing the time, keeping you company. The other thing young people always want to know about is being in the know. And again, in every category I've worked in and everywhere, that's always the same. They want to be talking about the things that everyone else is talking about, be that music or television or celebrity news. And radio is a great source of this. So I think editorial in particular in radio is still absolutely important. The other thing I think is that we can do more with our technology to fit with the rest of what they're doing. We can offer more online, both visually and in text. Some of our Radio 1 and Radio 1 Extra presenters work well with this, seamlessly moving between their radio programs and their web accounts, as some of you may have heard when you were at Radio Festival. So I think technology online is quite a key thing for the young and keeping them hooked into radio. And I think phones are also critical. Not necessarily always the iPhone, to be fair, but I think generally younger people want to have everything in one piece of kit, most likely a phone, and I think we're only just scratching the surface of what we can do here. So I think there will always be needs that are met by radio, and there are things that we can do to help ourselves a bit more with technology. That's it for me.